The evening in the quiet town park was serene. Ethan sat on a bench, letting the calmness of the moment sink in. The air was cool, the sun dipping lower in the sky as he waited for his younger brother, Zane, to finish his soccer practice. Ethan enjoyed these peaceful moments, where the world felt still, untouched by chaos. There was nothing around him but the rustling of leaves in the trees and the distant hum of life continuing on the other side of the park. But peace is often fragile, and just as Ethan had settled into the quiet, the tranquility was shattered. The low rumble of engines grew louder, disturbing the otherwise silent evening. At first, Ethan thought nothing of it. Maybe a car passing by, or someone revving their engine for fun. But the noise persisted, growing in intensity. His eyes lifted just as a group of bikers rounded the corner, their motorcycles roaring as they approached the park. There were 5 of them in total, their leather jackets adorned with patches and their faces hidden behind dark helmets and glasses. The bikes slowed as they neared Ethan, the deep growl of the engines reverberating in the still air. As they parked nearby, the riders remained silent, eyes flicking over to him in a way that made his skin crawl. The mood shifted instantly. What had been an ordinary, peaceful moment now felt charged with tension. Ethan remained still, not wanting to draw attention but unable to ignore the feeling creeping up his spine. He could feel the heat of their gaze, could sense the unspoken hostility in the air. The bikers dismounted, one by one, each movement deliberate, as if marking their territory. They spoke little, their presence loud enough to speak for them. The leader, a towering figure with a scar running down his cheek, took a long look at Ethan. There was something in his eyes, a mix of amusement and challenge. He leaned casually against his bike, arms folded, studying Ethan as if he were some kind of prey. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to stay composed. He was alone, with no backup, no one to call for help. The quiet park, once a refuge, now felt like a trap closing in around him. The gang seemed to find his discomfort amusing, their smirks and low chuckles barely audible, but cutting through the air like knives. One of the bikers, a younger man with a messy beard, stepped forward, his boots thudding against the ground as he approached Ethan. His eyes locked onto Ethan's, a silent challenge that made the air feel thick with unspoken threats. Ethan could feel his pulse quicken, his breath shallow. He wasn't sure what the bikers wanted, but it was clear they weren't here to make friends. The leader finally spoke, his voice gruff, but there was no mistaking the underlying aggression. His words were few, but they hit with a weight that lingered in the air long after he'd finished speaking. The tension hung thick, and Ethan knew then that this wasn't just a random encounter. The group stood there, as if deciding what to do next. Every second felt like an eternity. The silence between them stretched, each of the bikers sizing Ethan up, as if looking for a reason to escalate things. Ethan could feel the weight of their judgment, the oppressive air of intimidation hanging over him. He had to keep his cool. One wrong move, one slip-up, and everything could change. The gang's presence was almost suffocating, their bodies towering over Ethan, each movement calculated to provoke. They were an undeniable force, and for a moment, he wondered if he'd misjudged how dangerous this situation could be. As the gang lingered, their attention was briefly diverted by the sound of someone shouting from the soccer field. Zane was running towards the exit, finally finished with practice. Ethan's heart raced, but he stayed still, trying to play it calm. The bikers, noticing the new arrival, shifted their focus for a moment. It was a brief relief, but one that didn't last long. They turned back to Ethan, their eyes narrowing, knowing full well that their presence had already unsettled him. The leader grinned, a cold, unsettling smile, before mounting his bike. The rest followed suit, revving their engines one last time before they tore off into the distance, leaving behind the unsettling memory of their visit. The sound of their bikes slowly faded into the background, but the tension they'd left in the air lingered. Ethan sat there for a moment longer, processing what had just happened. His hands were still clenched, his body tense, but he allowed himself a deep breath. The quiet had returned, but it wasn't the same. It would never be the same again. As Zane approached, his face lit up with a smile, unaware of the encounter his brother had just survived. Ethan couldn't bring himself to share what had just transpired, the weight of it, the threat that had almost consumed him. Instead, he stood, clapping his brother on the back as if nothing had happened, but his mind was still racing, the shadow of the biker's presence still hanging over him. The park was once again calm, but in Ethan's heart, the storm had only just begun. Ethan's heart pounded as the bikers, now clearly identified as a group led by Rocco, dismounted from their motorcycles. The leader's gaze bore into him, as if calculating Ethan's every move, every expression. The other two bikers, Dante and Marco, loitered nearby, circling him like wolves eyeing prey. They exuded an air of superiority, clearly used to intimidating others. But Ethan didn't flinch. Rocco's grin was a twisted mix of amusement and challenge. He took slow, deliberate steps toward Ethan, sizing him up with every inch he gained. There was something in his eyes, predatory, calculating. He didn't speak at first, letting the silence hang thick, heavy with the weight of unspoken threats. The sound of distant traffic seemed to fade, the park growing eerily quiet as if the world itself was holding its breath. Dante and Marco flanked Rocco, creating a wall around Ethan. The leader finally spoke, his voice low and grating, tinged with mockery. "You got lost or something, kid? This isn't the place for someone like you." His words were slow, like he was savoring the moment, gauging Ethan's reaction. Ethan felt the pressure building. He could feel their eyes, feel their presence closing in. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to stand up, to leave, to run. But he didn't. Instead, he sat there, his hands gripping the edge of the bench, nails digging into the wood as he forced himself to remain still. His mind raced, trying to calculate the next move, the safest way to de-escalate, or at least survive. The last thing he wanted was to provoke these men, but something about the way they hovered around him, their taunts, their ridicule, it made his blood boil. Rocco, sensing Ethan's discomfort, leaned in closer, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "What's the matter, huh? You scared? You don't belong here." His eyes flicked to Dante and Marco, who both chuckled, their laughter like cold steel scraping against the calm evening air. Ethan's breath came a little faster, but he kept his gaze steady, refusing to look away. His heart hammered in his chest, but he wasn't about to show them weakness. He had learned early on that showing fear only invited more trouble. His inner discipline kicked in, and he held his ground. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Just waiting for my brother." Rocco's grin widened, clearly enjoying the tension he was creating. He straightened up, taking a step back, but his eyes never left Ethan. Dante and Marco exchanged knowing glances, their laughter fading but their presence still overwhelming. The leader wasn't done yet, though. He wasn't going to let Ethan off that easily. "You think you're tough, don't you?" Rocco said, his tone mocking but also testing. "You think you can just sit here like you own the place?" Ethan didn't respond, but his muscles tensed. He felt the weight of their gaze, felt the pressure building inside him, like a ticking time bomb. He knew this wasn't just about him anymore. They were trying to break him down, to see how much he could take before he cracked. Rocco moved closer again, this time invading Ethan's personal space, just enough to make him uncomfortable. The scent of cigarette smoke clung to him, and his breath was sharp and acrid. The leader leaned in, his voice low and threatening. "You got something to prove, kid? Because I'm not impressed." Ethan kept his composure, but inside, a storm raged. His thoughts were a blur of adrenaline and anger, but he fought to keep his emotions in check. If he let them see his fear, they would win. And he wasn't about to let them win. The tension was unbearable, each second stretching into eternity. It felt like the world around them had gone silent, the only sound the rhythmic thrum of Ethan's heartbeat. Dante and Marco stood like statues, their eyes locked on him, waiting for something, anything, that would signal a crack in his calm exterior. Rocco, however, was looking for a different kind of reaction, one that would give him the upper hand. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Rocco straightened up and backed away. He glanced at his two companions, who seemed disappointed by Ethan's refusal to crumble. For a moment, the air seemed to clear, the tension easing slightly, though it still hung heavy in the park. "All right," Rocco said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But don't think for a second that you've won. With a final lingering look at Ethan, he turned and walked back to his bike. Dante and Marco followed, each casting one last glance at Ethan before mounting their motorcycles. The group of bikers revved their engines, the noise once again filling the air, drowning out the quiet that had returned. But as they rode off into the distance, Ethan was left with more than just the fading sound of their engines. The weight of the encounter lingered, and his pulse still raced. He had survived, but the message had been clear: this wasn't over. Zane's voice called out from behind him, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. His younger brother, oblivious to the danger that had just passed, jogged toward him with a smile. But Ethan wasn't smiling. His eyes were still locked on the distant road where the bikers had disappeared, his mind replaying every moment of the encounter. "Ready to go?" Zane asked, unaware of the storm that had just passed. Ethan nodded, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He had kept his composure, but the tension from that brief exchange would stay with him long after they left the park. This was just the beginning, he knew. And next time, he might not be so lucky. The noise of the motorcycles still echoed in the air as Rocco and his crew began to rev their engines once more. Ethan's eyes stayed locked on them, his body tense, still processing the encounter. His mind was racing, but he kept his composure. But then, something changed. From the corner of his eye, he saw Zane walking toward him, his soccer bag slung over his shoulder, his face lighting up with a smile as he neared. The bikers, their attention shifting, locked eyes on Zane. A dark, knowing smile crept across Rocco's face as he turned to face the younger brother. Dante and Marco followed suit, their gazes hardening. The tension that had been there between them and Ethan was nothing compared to what now hung in the air. Zane, innocent and unaware of the danger, had no idea what was coming. Rocco's grin widened. "Looks like the little brother's here," he said, his voice dripping with malice, but it wasn't directed at Ethan anymore. It was Zane who was now the target. The bikers stood still, sizing him up, their eyes gleaming with a hunger for conflict. The leader stepped toward Zane, his presence like a shadow looming over him, menacing and cold. Zane, sensing the change in the air, stopped in his tracks. His smile faltered as he noticed the tension between the bikers and Ethan. He looked at his brother for a sign, but Ethan's face remained unreadable, his body stiff with tension, as if preparing for something that could break at any moment. Rocco took a slow step closer to Zane. "You think your brother's tough? You think you're safe just because you're with him?" The words weren't just threats. They were designed to break through any sense of security Zane had, to make him feel small, vulnerable. Rocco's voice dropped to a low, dangerous growl. "Maybe it's time you learned a lesson in respect?" Zane's eyes flickered to Ethan for reassurance, but the pressure was mounting. Ethan could see his younger brother hesitate, unsure of what to do, how to react. He felt the fear creeping in, knowing that if he didn't act fast, things could escalate beyond control. The tension between the bikers and the brothers had reached a boiling point. Ethan's grip on the bench tightened as his years of training flashed in his mind. His martial arts discipline had taught him control over his emotions, his actions, his reactions. It had taught him how to read a situation and assess how to respond with precision. But that didn't mean he wasn't feeling the weight of the moment. He had to protect his brother, no matter what. Rocco took another step closer to Zane, his voice taunting, low and menacing. "You think you're tough, huh? You want to stand up to me, to us? I'll show you what happens when you don't know your place." Ethan stood up abruptly, the decision made in an instant. His eyes locked with Rocco's, and he stepped forward, positioning himself between the bikers and Zane. His stance was calm but firm, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths. He wasn't about to let this go any further, not while Zane was standing there, unsure, vulnerable. Rocco's eyes narrowed as he faced Ethan now, the challenge clear. "You really want to do this?" His voice was sharp, the amusement in it replaced by cold anger. Ethan's response was measured, his words firm. "Leave him out of this," he said, his voice steady, but there was an unmistakable edge of warning. He wasn't about to back down now. His fists clenched, but his body remained relaxed, ready for whatever might come next. Years of training had taught him to wait for the right moment. And he wasn't about to give Rocco the satisfaction of provoking him into a hasty move. The bikers stood still for a moment, the tension palpable. Dante and Marco exchanged glances, silently weighing their options. Rocco, however, didn't back down. He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You've got guts, I'll give you that. But it's too late for peace." Ethan didn't flinch. His body was a coiled spring, ready to react at the slightest movement. He knew Rocco was trying to provoke him, trying to get him to make the first aggressive move, but Ethan wasn't about to give in. His focus was sharp, his mind clear. There was too much at stake here, and he wasn't going to let this situation spiral out of control. Zane, now standing behind him, looked from Ethan to the bikers, a mix of confusion and fear on his face. But Ethan's calm demeanor seemed to reassure him. As much as Zane wanted to speak, to fight back, Ethan knew it wasn't the right time. The standoff lasted only a few moments longer, but to Ethan, it felt like an eternity. Finally, Rocco took a step back, his gaze still locked on Ethan. "You're lucky today," he muttered, the words carrying an unspoken threat. "Don't think this is over." He turned on his heel, signaling to Dante and Marco, who reluctantly followed his lead. As they mounted their bikes, the tension that had filled the air began to dissipate. The sound of the engines roaring to life filled the park once again, but this time, it was not the same. There was no victory in the air, only the faint promise of something unresolved. The bikers revved their engines one last time before speeding off, their shadows disappearing into the distance. Ethan didn't move at first. He waited, his eyes watching the road where the bikers had vanished. The calm that had returned was not the same as before. The quiet was now charged with uncertainty, with a simmering tension that wouldn't easily fade. Zane stepped up beside him, his voice low. "What just happened?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were still with the encounter, the way things had almost escalated beyond repair. But for now, he knew they were safe. For now, they had survived. And that was enough. "Let's go home," Ethan finally said, his voice steady. He turned to walk away, Zane following closely behind, still processing the encounter. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the bikers' visit was only the beginning. The bikers were walking away, their engines rumbling as they prepared to leave, but Rocco couldn't resist taking one last jab at Ethan. He turned slowly, his boots scraping the gravel, and the grin on his face twisted into something darker. "You really think you're tough, kid? You think you can take us down?" His words dripped with mockery, challenging Ethan to prove himself. The others, Dante and Marco, paused, their eyes narrowing, still watching, still ready to strike if given the chance. But Ethan wasn't intimidated. His body was still, like a coiled spring, but his mind was clear. He had nothing to prove, but he wasn't about to let these bikers walk all over him either. His breath was steady, the calm before the storm. They underestimated him, saw him as nothing more than a scared teen, a target for their cruel jabs and intimidation. Then, with a sudden movement, one of them lunged forward. It was Marco, the youngest and the most reckless of the group, his fists raised as he aimed for Ethan's chest. But Ethan was faster, his training kicking in without thought. As Marco's fist came toward him, Ethan stepped to the side, his body flowing like water, avoiding the strike with barely any effort. In the same fluid motion, he struck, his elbow connecting with Marco's ribs. The sound of air rushing out of Marco's lungs was deafening, and he crumpled to the ground, gasping for breath. The two other bikers froze, disbelief painted across their faces. They had expected a weak, frightened kid, but what they saw instead was controlled, precise action. Rocco, anger flashing across his face, stepped forward, pulling his fists up to his chest. "You're gonna regret that, kid," he sneered, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Ethan didn't give him time to think. He didn't need to make any big moves, didn't need to show off. He simply responded with pure discipline, his body moving as if it had been trained for moments like this. Rocco swung wildly, but Ethan easily dodged, his movements sharp and calculated. A quick jab to Rocco's jaw sent the leader staggering back, a look of shock in his eyes. Dante, seeing his friends falter, charged, but Ethan was already one step ahead. He sidestepped Dante's attack, grabbed his arm, and twisted, sending the biker crashing into the ground. The entire fight lasted mere seconds, But to the bikers, it felt like an eternity. Their initial arrogance had crumbled as Ethan, calm and focused, dismantled their threats one by one. The powerful, brash bikers were left stunned, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The leader, Rocco, who thought he could control the situation with nothing more than his intimidation, found himself on his knees, trying to catch his breath. Ethan stood over them, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. There was no trace of arrogance or pride in his expression, only the cold confidence of someone who had already won. The bikers, still recovering, exchanged uncertain glances. They had underestimated him, thinking that his calm demeanor meant weakness, that his quiet nature meant fear. But they were wrong. Ethan didn't need to prove himself with unnecessary aggression. His strength was in his control, in the way he had dismantled their attempts with no wasted movement. Rocco, still reeling from the blow, finally managed to speak. "You think this is over? You think you've won?" His voice was strained, his usual bravado gone. Ethan's expression remained unchanged. "I'm not interested in fighting. But I won't let you hurt my brother." His words were simple, but they carried weight, a promise that he wasn't backing down. The bikers, humiliated and stunned by the turn of events, finally backed off. Rocco helped Marco to his feet, and they slowly began to retreat, but not without a final warning. "This isn't the last time you'll see us," Rocco muttered under his breath, his tone laced with resentment. As the bikers sped off into the distance, the sound of their engines growing fainter, Ethan stood still, his body relaxed but alert. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't let anger or fear guide him. He had simply acted. He turned to Zane, who was still standing behind him, wide-eyed, taking in the scene. "You all right?" Ethan asked, his voice calm as always. Zane nodded, still processing the fact that his older brother had just taken down a gang of bikers without breaking a sweat. "Thanks." Ethan smiled briefly, but the weight of the encounter still lingered. He had protected his brother, kept them both safe. But the tension in the air hadn't completely dissipated. The bikers might have left, but their words, their challenge, stayed with him. He knew this wouldn't be the last time they'd have to face people like them. He couldn't afford to relax, not yet. "Let's go," Ethan said, motioning for Zane to follow him. They walked out of the park, the quiet returning to the space around them, but Ethan knew the peace wouldn't last long. He was ready for whatever came next. As the bikers retreated, the atmosphere in the park shifted. The once tense silence was replaced by the murmurs of onlookers who had witnessed the entire exchange. Eyes lingered on Ethan, some with awe, others with disbelief. It was clear that his calmness and the ease with which he had taken control of the situation had earned him respect. The bikers, who had come in full force, now looked like nothing more than a defeated, confused group of men. Ethan, standing tall and composed, was a stark contrast. His movements were smooth, purposeful, and the crowd could sense it. He wasn't just a teenager, he was someone who knew what he was doing. Zane, still trying to process the chaos, stood beside his brother, his gaze never leaving Ethan. There was a sense of awe in his eyes, admiration for the strength Ethan had shown, not just in defeating the bikers but in how he had handled the situation. Zane had always looked up to his older brother, but now, seeing him in action like this, he understood just how much strength Ethan truly possessed. It wasn't the physical kind, the kind that could be seen or measured by punches thrown or bodies hit. No, it was something deeper, something that ran through him, calm and unwavering. It was the kind of strength that left a mark on people, the kind that demanded respect. But Ethan knew something more important than respect was at stake. As the crowd began to disperse, and the last of the bikers disappeared into the distance, Ethan turned to his younger brother, his expression soft but firm. Zane, caught in the aftershock of the encounter, couldn't help but ask, "Why didn't you just keep fighting them, Ethan? You could have beaten all of them. You were amazing out there." Ethan paused, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. The adrenaline had faded, but the lesson had already begun to settle within him. "Zane," he began, his voice calm but filled with a quiet authority, "violence should never be the first choice. Ever. It's not about who can throw the hardest punch or who can knock someone down the fastest." He looked at Zane directly, making sure his words landed. "The real strength is knowing when to walk away." It's knowing your worth, your integrity, and not letting anyone take that from you. Zane listened intently, but the words didn't settle immediately. He still felt the rush of excitement, the satisfaction of seeing his brother take down the bikers with nothing but pure precision. But as he looked at Ethan, he realized that this wasn't about the fight at all. Ethan had chosen not to fight. He had simply acted when the situation demanded it. But beyond that, he had walked away, teaching Zane that strength wasn't about causing harm, it was about holding on to what mattered, about maintaining peace even when everything else screamed for war. Sometimes, Ethan continued, standing up for yourself isn't about fighting. It's about walking away from the fight and keeping your peace. Those bikers? They were just trying to provoke us, to see if we'd react. We didn't have to prove anything to them. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. Zane nodded slowly, trying to understand. Ethan's words were still swirling in his head. The thrill of the confrontation had been strong, and it was hard to just let go of that feeling. But he knew his brother was right. The lesson was deeper than just defending themselves. It was about carrying yourself with confidence, with a calmness that showed the world you weren't just a target. You were a person who stood tall, no matter the circumstances. The two brothers stood there for a few moments, the park around them gradually emptying as people returned to their daily lives. Ethan didn't look like he had just been in a fight. He looked like he had always been at peace with himself, even in the most chaotic of situations. It was that peace that seemed to radiate from him, and Zane couldn't help but admire it. It was clear now, real strength was more than just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. It was the resilience to stay calm when the world around you was anything but. The silence between them was broken only by the sound of footsteps as they began to walk home together. Ethan was the one who led, but Zane walked close behind, trying to take it all in. There was a lot to process, a lot to learn. The bikers might have left, but their final words still echoed in Zane's mind, their promise of return hanging heavy in the air. But Ethan remained unfazed. If anything, his calmness had only grown in the face of that threat. He knew it wasn't over. But for now they had won, not through force, but through wisdom. "You did good today," Zane said, breaking the silence. Ethan turned to him with a faint smile, not one of arrogance or pride, but of quiet understanding. "We both did. But remember, it's not the fight that matters, Zane. It's what you do with the peace you've earned." Zane nodded again, a newfound respect for his brother settling into his chest. He was proud of him, but more than that, he was beginning to understand the true meaning of strength, and how, sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is walk away when everyone expects them to fight. They walked home in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. The weight of the day was still there, but there was an unspoken bond between the two brothers. No words were necessary. They understood each other in a way that only siblings could. And with each step, the world around them seemed just a little bit quieter, a little bit more peaceful. Rocco's last words might have been a threat, but to Ethan, they were just noise, empty, hollow words from a group that couldn't understand what true strength really was. And as they walked away from the park, the sun beginning to set behind them, Ethan knew that no matter what came next, he was ready. He wasn't afraid of what might happen. He was only concerned with staying true to who he was, and making sure his brother understood that too.